Welcome everyone. Thanks for having me. Feel free to ask questions throughout today. So we'll try to make this interactive. But yeah, grab that mic if you can. Okay, so let's start with a little reminder that configuration changes can have pretty big impacts. And so this is something that's a huge challenge for us. Anyone here used YAML? Okay, yeah, like everyone. Anyone here ever had a production issue because of YAML? About half, yeah. Yeah, so there's some challenges with YAML. So we're going to talk about maybe a better option. And so let's dive in. So for today, I'm going to just be writing some code and then showing some examples. And hopefully you get a sense for what Pickle is. So just as some background, Pickle is an open source configuration language created by Apple. And really for me, the three key parts of it are that it's safe. So it gives you a lot better safety than things like YAML. It gives you a lot better reusability. Something that's kind of hard in YAML is to avoid copy and paste and when you want to reuse things. And then also productive. It has great tooling kind of built around Pickle. So let's just dive in and start writing some Pickle. So I'm in a project here. I'm in a Pickle file. And there's a number of different ways to use Pickle. We'll see some of those today. But I'm starting with just this file. And then I do have this build running continuously in the background that's going to compile my Pickle source code into my YAML configuration. So usually with Pickle, you don't have to do it this way, but usually you go from Pickle to the type of file format that your configuration system supports. So if you're doing Kubernetes, probably YAML. If you're doing CloudFormation, then also YAML. If you're doing GitHub Actions, also YAML. But there are other languages, other places where you need different things. And you can go from Pickle to other languages. But really, I think YAML is the primary one. So let's start writing some code. So first, Pickle is declarative. So I can come in and do my lovely foo bar example there. And so when I save that change, it's going to rebuild, recompile essentially my Pickle source code. And now we see the wonderful YAML there where we get my foo is bar there in the YAML. So that's our kind of just starter. It's declarative, has some other things on top of it. But let's go a little bit further on to the next one. So let's go into types. So one of the really nice things I really like strong in static typing is that we can specify types in our configuration. And so now let's come in and, I don't know, let's have a name. And I'm going to say that my name is a string. And now I can give it a value, right? So there's my value, ASDF. And I can save that. And of course, the YAML is going to be what we expect. But if for some reason I try to put in not a string, then I actually get a compile error. We can actually, if we save this, we'll see it down here, say like, it'll actually tell me all the details in the compile error about that. Or in the IDE, so there's VS Code and IntelliJ is what I'm using, plugins. And I think there's also like Z plugins and other plugins. But now I actually see in my IDE, the red squiggly, quickly identify that I've violated the types there. So great, let's get that back to working. So types. Awesome. In our configuration, we can become safer by putting some constraints around what we can define and how we can define things in our configuration. So that's kind of the first step to safer configuration. But it goes a little bit further in Pickle because we can also have type constraints. So I can come in and say, all right, I want a port, and my port is going to be an int. And let's just set it to, we'll start with 80. So that's valid configuration, right? I can save this, and that should recompile. And then we'll see, sure enough, my port 80 there is OK. But I can actually now come in and say that the int must be greater than 1024. And now that is a compile error. We're not able to actually compile my configuration because we have violated the constraint. We get the error message there in the IDE, tell me what the constraint violation is. So I can come in and correct that. Oh, and it has to be larger than 1024. There we go. And now my configuration is OK again. So type constraints are awesome, huge part of the way that we can really concisely define what the valid states are for our configuration. OK, so that's types and type constraints. Pause there. Any questions so far? Anything you're like, oh, I really don't understand what Pickle is yet? Anything? Go ahead. Good question. Yeah, so the question is about like, as the user of Pickle, how is this helping me? And so a big part of it is by having the constraints around what means valid configuration. And we do that through types and type constraints, and we'll see some other ways in a little bit. And then the developer, as they're actually writing their configuration, they're going to, just like you saw here, see those compile errors, and they're not going to be able to actually output a valid YAML configuration until it's actually valid configuration. And so it just puts this gate, like a compiler for a compiled language, it's going to put this gate in front of getting to that thing that then gets used by the system or run on a system if we're talking about compilers, right? So it really is kind of like a compiler in that it's just providing that gate that won't allow us to get to that next step, production, updating our IAC, whatever it may be, until we have our configuration in a valid state. Yeah, good question. Yeah, go ahead.
What you're getting to next. Can you define your own types?
Oh, great question. Let's do that. So can you define your own types? Absolutely. So you've seen some of the built-in types. So let's define our own type here. So I'm going to say let's have a class person. And a person is going to have a property that is called name and is a string. And of course we could put in type constraints on here just like you saw before, but I'll leave it just as that. And now if I save this, and it recompiles, you'll see that nothing has gone into my configuration. This is just like a synthetic type that's only for compile time, essentially. And so then I can start actually using my type. So let's create a person, Bob, and Bob is going to be a new person. And now we can set that property name equal to Bob. Now, because we've defined or declared a property, now we go back to our YAML and see that, sure enough, now we have something in our configuration that is that type person, but that the actual type information is now gone from the output artifact. This would be like reified types in Java or something. Okay, so that's how we can define types. There's a couple other ways that we'll see in a minute, but there's a little more that I want to show here. So we can also, of course, have more properties. Let's put in like an age, and let's say that age is an int, and we want to set Bob's age equal to 32, right? So that's all fine, but what about nullability? So an important property of modern type systems is often to have some way to express nullability. And so if I want to be able to say that Bob's age is null, that's the best age, then I can't do that. That's actually invalid because by default, the types are non-nullable. If I do want them to be nullable, then I'm going to add a question mark, which is similar to Kotlin syntax for how we express nullability. So now that age property can be null, but we have to explicitly say whether or not it's nullable. We can also set a default there, and then I don't even need to set the property there. Okay, so that's our basic types. We can call them classes, schemas, but really it is the way that we can constrain the types that we're working with, because oftentimes it's helpful to represent things in other than strings, ints, booleans, lists, other basic primitive types. Okay, so that's our classes, and we're going to see a couple other examples for ways that we can represent data, essentially, and constrain data. But did that answer that question? Great, awesome. Okay, any other questions before I go on to more pickle? Okay, so we talked about nullability. Here's something amazing, comments. Amazing to have a declarative language that supports multi-line comments, single-line comments, but it even goes further because I can set up, let's call it like first name, no, let's call this one place, and my place is gonna be a string, and I'm gonna just set it to Denver. Now we can come in on any property anywhere and do a triple slash, and now we can say this place is cold, right? And now if we go look at this property, anywhere we reference that property, you'll get the information about the comment. It's a doc comment. So this is helpful if you're creating libraries, then you likely want to put doc comments on your classes, on your properties, everywhere you can, so that now your users, back to the question earlier, now your users have, even beyond the type information, also have docs for what you can do in configuration. Explain things through that. So great comments, doc comments, that's all great. So another one here is another way to constrain what we can do is to create type aliases, or really just have a more concise syntax for this. So I can create a type alias, and you'll see some code completion in here as I'm doing some of this, so some really good tooling around this. let's create a type alias called non-empty string. And this type alias is going to be a string with a constraint, and my constraint is going to be not is empty. Okay? So that's my basic type alias. So now I can start using that type instead of having to repeat that particular constraint. So let's create a property that's going to be, I don't know, first name, and this is going to be a non-empty string and the value. So you'll see that when I have an empty string, it's like, hey, sorry, compile error. Essentially, you can't do that. It has to have a valid value. And then, of course, you can come in and put in multiple type constraints. You can separate these with logical operators or with commas. So I can also say, like, this dot contains A. You know, for some reason, we wanted to make sure that our string contained the letter A. So all sorts of different things we can do with the type constraints and the type aliases combined together. Okay, so that's type aliases. So one of the things that is important in this new world where many of us are using coding assistants is that there is coding assistant support for all the new toys we want to be playing with. And so I was actually pretty surprised. I've tried a few of them, but we'll see if this works here. I can come into, I'm using QDeveloper in this case, but I think you get a similar experience in other coding assistants. You can say, explain this code, and okay, so it actually knows, like, this is Pickle. So Pickle's like brand new. I think it's been out for like 9 months or something like that. So a lot of the coding assistants have been trained or at least know enough about the new things like Pickle that can actually come in and describe code and help you write it and all that kind of stuff. So I think that was kind of important because if we're using coding assistants, you know, on stuff, it hopefully will work with new things, and sure enough, it seems like it works pretty well. It explained to me those type constraints and all that kind of stuff. So that's a recommendation I would make is when you choose new technologies, choose ones that your coding assistants can help you with. Okay, next little feature of Pickle is enums. So if we want to define an enum, so this is something that can only be constrained to specific values, then what we can actually do is just create a type alias. I'm going to create a type alias for something called machine, and then we'll say Windows or Linux. So that's how we define the enum in Pickle. And so now I can come in and say mine is a machine, and it's going to be equal to a Mac. No, that's an invalid value. You can't set your machine to a Mac because that is not in the type alias of machine. It's not a valid enum value. So my favorite operating system, which I don't present on because Linux, is Linux. So we'll put in Linux there for my machine. I present on Windows because it's a little more reliable for that sort of thing. Okay, so enums, great to have built into the language there. So now the next feature I want to cover is objects. So for objects, this allows us to define the kind of anonymous classes essentially. So let's come in and write a build config object, and my build config is going to have a lang. Let's make that a string, and we're going to put in the language of Kotlin. So now if I save this, we should hopefully get this to compile. Is it going to, do I have an error somewhere? Oh no, where's my error? Somewhere up here. Let's go look at our error message and see. Oh, we can't do the types in objects. That was the mistake I made. Interesting that the IDE didn't tell me about that. I'll have to file a bug on that one. But there we go, lang Kotlin. Now let's go look at our config here. So there we go. You can see that's just kind of the object structure of YAML. So that's our basic kind of anonymous object. We didn't have to define a class to get that object structure. But there's something cool we can do when we work with these objects is we can amend them. And so I want to have another build config. Let's call this one, I don't know, newer. Okay, and to set a property to this amended version of this build config, what we do is we put the previous instance that we're going to reference there in parentheses, and then we can come in and override things. So I could say lang equals Scala, and then I can add additional properties to this as well. I can say like version equals and put in a version, and then if we save this, we'll see that sure enough, there's my newer object there. So it used the name here, build config, and then you'll see that it used the name newer for that second one. So you can adjust the names however you want to, but that's how the templates and amending templates work. Yeah, question?
We define variable types, but not in objects. Is it inferring the type, sorry? Is it inferring the type, or could you type lang equals 2? Or is it inferring that because build config is lang equals string?
On objects, well, let's try it.
Can you type 2
So
then?
it's like put in like an int here. So it's just going to override it. There is no schema in this case. It's like an anonymous object, like essentially like JSON, right? It's like a JSON data structure at this point. So if you want a lot of safety, you're going to go to classes and type aliases. But there is this way to amend objects, and I think we can actually do this on. Let's try it on our person. So we had a person named Bob, right? And I think we can come in and amend Bob and add some properties to Bob. But let's see if that's actually going to work. May not. There is a way to like amend some things, but I think it's. Oh, didn't like that. Available properties, age and name. So, okay, we can't amend a class. I think there is maybe a word you can put in front of class to actually make it amendable. I think it's maybe open or something like that, which will make it amendable. But by default, the class is going to be closed, so you can't amend it like I'm doing here. But the anonymous objects, essentially, you can amend properties into and override properties with whatever type information you want. Yeah, go ahead. So there is a way to essentially dive down in, but you're going to have to specify all the properties down the chain. There's not something like lenses is a functional programming way to do kind of nested mutations, and I haven't seen anything like lenses for Pickle yet. But yeah. So as far as I know, no lens kind of API for Pickle. But good question. Yeah,
I have just a quick question because you sort of touched on it, but looking in the YAML, the class and the object appear the same. So is one of them just a stronger typed thing, or are there other differences between classes
good question.
and objects?
Yeah,
because
so
the YAML representation is the same.
Yeah, so oops, I closed that. So because YAML doesn't have any type information built into it. Oh, and it went away because I've got an invalid. Let's get this thing building again, and then we'll go look at it. So because YAML doesn't have any type information in it, when it gets transformed to YAML, you lose all the type information. So it's really there for the developer who is working on the Pickle code, writing their configuration, so that they can make sure that they have correct configuration, valid configuration, before they go to YAML. So really it's just like types in a compiled language. They're mostly there for the developer at developer time. And then you can think of YAML as your like binary output where a lot of that information is gone. Okay. There we go. Now we got my YAML back. Okay. All right, we'll continue on. We covered templates. So there are some APIs for collection data structures here. So first is a listing. So when I define this listing, I'm going to define it as a local, and I'll show you why for that in a second. And then I'm going to say, let's create a new listing of string. There we go. I should be using let's do that. Okay. Oh. This way. There we go. Okay, so new listing of string. So you'll see that there are some generics in Pickle as well, so we can generify things like lists and maps and other things. But now let's come in and add our animals. We've got a cat and we've got a dog, right? And the reason why I made that thing local was because I didn't actually want that to show up in my compiled YAML. If I make it not local, then that's going to show up in there, right? But I don't want that one to show up. I actually want some other thing to show up. So let's create a new thing called animal. And this is going to be a structure where I'm going to do a for loop. So we're going to say for animal in my animals list. And then we've got our for loop where now we can create a new basic object and set the name equal to my underscore animal, right? And yeah, that should be good, I think. So let's try that. It should compile. And now we can see that now I've kind of just manipulated my data structure. So there's a lot of different ways to start with a data structure and then do some mutation on it or transformation on it to get to the type of structure that we then need in our YAML. Put local in front of an object. Ooh, let's go try. So like this one, right? Local? No. Oh, and maybe if I type it correctly. Let's see. Oh, so yeah, can do local object. Cool. As long as you type correctly. Nice to have a compiler that tells me when I've not typed things correctly. Okay, so we've got for loops. We've also got maps. So you can have a map from one type to another type. We've got sets. We've got if expressions. But I want to skip ahead to functions. So function, kind of weird in a declarative language to have the ability to have a function, but you can. And so I'm going to have a function that is just an adds to an int, and the body of that is going to be I plus 1, just for simplicity. So that's our function. Now we can use this, right? So I could say like 2 equals adder with 1, and of course that's going to run that function. So there's very few places in Pickle where we can have side effects. So most of the time this is like totally deterministic functions. It's like this like single pass through Pickle to get us to our output values. But there are a few places where we can interact with the external system essentially. It's environment variables and properties files you can read in. And so your behavior can actually change potentially if you've passed in different inputs into the transformation of Pickle to your YAML file. But most of the time, these functions are, well, they're always pure functions. There is no ability to have a side effect within the function, but maybe an input to that function changes when you do your Pickle evaluation. Okay, and then there's ways to like mutate a map or a collection with a map function. And then there's also libraries. So I do want to show just a little bit about libraries before we go on to the next one here. But I have a library here called helpers. And in helpers, I've defined a class. I probably should have put some dot comments on this. And then I've got a function in Denver that uses that address class. And so, of course, we can come in here. I've already imported it. And I can say, let's give it a name first. We'll say helpers.inDenver, right? And I get code completion on this. This is just a local library, but we'll look in a little bit at libraries that are external. And let's call it, I don't know, First Street. There we go. And so that's going to now use my library. Let's go. Oh, I lost my YAML again. There it is. So that's going to use that library to have some logic and classes and that sort of thing. So we'll talk more about libraries in a little bit. The standard library, the things that come with Pickle, there's a bunch of stuff in there. There's regex, there's durations, there's all sorts of just great helper functions in there. I want to just show duration real quick because it's kind of a cool one. So I'm going to create a local, we'll call this one T, and I'm going to say, all right, 10, let's do 1 minute minus 10.seconds. So we can do math in the duration library. But if I try to actually print this thing out, so let's take off the local, I'm actually going to get an error because YAML doesn't have any way to represent durations. And so there is no normal way to convert a duration to YAML. So you'll see that, and we can go see the compiler down here. It's essentially going to say like, I can't convert a duration to YAML. And so we do have to do something different here. Let's create a property here called v, and v is going to, let's give this a type. So I get that type inference on here, Okay, now I'm going to say toUnit. I tell it what type of unit I want this in, and then I can get the value out of it. And now this will be valid YAML because value is a number. So we can look at that and see that, yep, 1 minute minus 10 seconds converted to seconds is going to give us 50. So again, in the YAML side, all of the type information is now gone, but at least on the Pickle side, we were able to have a nice API that's just built into the standard library for dealing with durations. So, Okay, so that's kind of our super quick. There's a bunch of other stuff in the standard library and a few more language features that I didn't cover, but really a pretty concise syntax, pretty limited amount of things that you can do with Pickle. I actually think this is important. Like, there's things like CDK and other languages that allow you to do more, but I actually really like for configuration that things are pretty constrained. You can learn this language in literally like an hour because it's a pretty small set of features for the language. So I think it's actually a positive thing that this isn't a general purpose language. It's really intended for configuration, and that's it. Okay, before I switch gears to some Spring stuff, any questions about Pickle before I go on? Yeah, go ahead.
Like you want to format it kind of
Like a multi-line string or something like that? Yeah, so good question. Let's try it. So let's say foo equals, and so now I get my multi-line string, right? I think that's what you're asking about was multi-line strings. So it does do the YAML style block for that. It also does clever things like you may be aware of the fun with no in YAML. No is actually a Boolean, right? In YAML. And so by default, if you do a no, then you can actually have a production issue, especially if you're working with the country of Norway, because YAML parsers will think that no is a Boolean meaning no, false. And so Pickle is just like, hey, I know about that fun little thing about YAML, and it's going to quote no for us so that it gets interpreted as a string and not a Boolean. So some nice things to save us from some YAML pain there. Okay. Good question. Okay, so let's move on to the next project here, which is going to show one of the cool features of Pickle that is pretty unique is language bindings. So in Pickle, there are language bindings where you can use Pickle to generate your YAML. That's all fine. But you can also use Pickle within another language. So an example of this is Spring Boot. I've got a Spring Boot. It could be Java. I've used Kotlin for this one. So there's JVM, Java, Kotlin support, and then a couple other languages. I think Go. I think there might be a Rust language binding now that's created from the community. But so language bindings allow us to use Pickle in another host language. So first, let's see what this looks like in Spring. So what we need is a schema to define what the structure of our configuration is going to be when we're going to use that configuration over in the other system. So I've created this module, I've given it a name, and then I have a class called server. Server has a listing of endpoints. I have a type constraint on there. An endpoint is just a name and a port. And then you'll see that my module is going to require that I define a server. So that's essentially my schema for my configuration. That isn't my actual configuration yet. That is just the schema that defines what my configuration looks like. So with the language bindings, we actually get a class that's generated from that schema. And so you can see my app config there is my generated class. And so this got generated for me through the language bindings in Pickle. And you can see it brought in some of the comments and stuff. So in this case, I had it generate Kotlin, but you can also generate Java or other languages as well. So now I have created a type-safe way for my Spring application configuration to be defined in Pickle. So first with the schema, then the code generation, where then I can actually use my configuration, right? I'm using it in this very basic HTTP server and returning it in the response, but obviously not the useful way to use configuration, but as an example, there we go. So then I have to have some way to define the actual configuration for my Spring application. And so I do that in a separate Pickle. And you can certainly move that schema Pickle out into a library, do that in different ways. You do need to have the schema, but it doesn't have to be in the same project like it is here. And so now I'm going to say, all right, I'm going to amend that module that I'm just referencing it through the file system there, but again, other ways to do that. So I'm going to amend that. And so because the schema back here said, I need a server, so it's left with no implementation, then my actual, when I amend that template, I need to now specify the server. So I specify it with a couple endpoints there. And let's go start up my server so we can verify that this all works. But so when the Spring Boot application starts, it's going to load that class that got generated from the schema. And then it's going to load the pickle configuration, and it's going to make sure that the pickle configuration conforms and can be turned into the actual class at runtime in the JVM. And it looks like it all started up good. And now if I go to localhost 8080, we'll see there's my configuration. So that's how we can use language bindings, just one example of that. And the Pickle team has explicitly added the Spring support as one of the kind of higher level language bindings available in Pickle. Okay, so questions about language bindings. I didn't go into kind of all the general concepts about language bindings, but did that make sense? Any questions about that, using it from other languages? Okay. All right, let's move on to the next example here. So let's see. Let's go to Kubernetes one. So there is this vast library ecosystem. Maybe not vast yet. There's a good, healthy library ecosystem around Pickle. A lot of it is driven by Apple and their needs. It would seem because they have support for Spring and Kubernetes and a number of other things that they've built those for themselves. But now there's a number of third-party libraries that have come out as well. And so one of the libraries in Pickle that has come out of Apple is Kubernetes. So they have taken the Kubernetes API, I think it comes from an open API specification, and they turn that into the Pickle type definitions for the Kubernetes YAML. And so this means that if we're using the Pickle Kubernetes library, then we can get to valid configuration before we create our YAML and give it over to Kubernetes. So you'll see that I'm importing the Kubernetes library here. This is just the import syntax. There's a little bit cleaner import syntax that I could use, but this is just the easy one that conveys like it's source-based. It's going to pull down essentially a zip file from somewhere. For security, you can actually restrict, when you build your Pickle, you can restrict which modules are able to be imported. So if you're in a environment where you don't want to allow anyone to use any Pickle, then you can do that through specifying essentially a allow list on when you do your Pickle evaluation. Okay, so we've got the two things that we're pulling in here from the Pickle Kubernetes library, but then I've also created another little library, which maybe at some point I'll actually publish it. Right now it's just in this project. But for Kubernetes, what we need to do is have a list of resources. So I'm defining my listing of K8 resource. And we can go in and look at that. And here's the Pickle source code for that K8 resource, right? And there's not a whole lot of stuff in there. API version in kind. Does it maybe extend? Oh, it extends the K8's object, which we can dive into as well. And then keep drilling in. But it's a pretty extensive library, all automatically generated from OpenAPI, I think, for the Kubernetes definitions. And so here, the first thing that I have is a little function that I've created called easydeployment.create, and I want to deploy Nginx on port 80. And let me show you what's underneath that. It's a function that takes some parameters and then is going to generate the deployment, which comes from the Kubernetes package, right? And then it's going to set all the properties on the deployment. So this gets, in usual YAML, this gets pretty tedious and repetitive. And so just put it into a function that's reusable, publish your library, and now you can have these much more tight interfaces to how you want to define things. So I love this about Pickle, that I can have that super easy reusability through libraries across this stuff. So okay, I'm creating my deployment. Then just for fun, I put in a config map, and so we can see the config map there. And then the YAML that comes out of that, I'll just show you the output YAML. So whole lot nicer for me to specify the Pickle, have the type safety, have the type constraints, all that kind of stuff, and get the YAML that I need to give to Kubernetes. So I think that's for me pretty compelling when I'm working with Kubernetes to write Pickle. Now, certainly I can't give my Pickle file to Kubernetes. I do have to give it the YAML file, so there has to be some process that you go through to go from pickle to YAML. You can put that into your CI if you want. But yeah, you do have to do that conversion in order to give Kubernetes what it needs, which is YAML. Okay, questions on the Kubernetes one? There's a lot of alternatives out there for this, but Helm charts is obviously a big one. So for me, the biggest differences are that I have a language that's really around configuration, but it's general configuration, so I can use it for more than just Kubernetes, and I do use it for a lot of different things, but it's one language that can be used in many places, whereas Helm charts, pretty sure most people just use that for Kubernetes. But so yeah, for me, that's a bit of a trade-off there. Maybe there's some downsides to that because Pickle is not just about Kubernetes. Maybe there could be some better features or something if it was only about Kubernetes, but it really is general configuration on any domain. Yeah, good question.
Are there any general tools to convert open API specs into Pickle libraries?
I haven't seen a generalized tool for that yet. If you go look in the repo that hosts the Kubernetes one, you can see how they do that in there. I would love for them to eventually just have a tool that would do an automatic conversion. I don't know if it's too nuanced for that or not, but the one that exists in the Kubernetes one has been replicated in other places as well. So good question. Yeah, question in the back.
I'm wondering if there are any security concerns about arbitrary code execution with any of this stuff?
It's a good question. One of the nice things about Pickle, which I don't know if this will totally answer it, but one of the nice things about Pickle is Pickle has no ability to write to the file system, to execute code. It is purely just this declarative format that then gets evaluated. And so I think for the most part, you're going to be pretty constrained on what the capabilities of evaluation of that can be. With the language bindings, you can do that evaluation, in a safe, environment within your application, and not have the ability for Pickle to somehow call make some execution to the underlying system. So I think generally it is like a normal declarative language in that it's not going to have kind of the escape hatches where, if you allow somebody to upload Python or Skylark, I think is the Python variant for Google's build system, Bazel, you potentially, if you're executing code, there's a lot of risk to that. In this, it's really interpreted and into the model that you're converting it to, so YAML or the language binding syntax. So I think it's going to be a lot safer than probably a lot of other options, but I don't want to say that it's 100% safe because I'm sure someone will find some way to break something. But yeah, good question.
So does that mean you can't execute it and pass in command line parameters? So say you wrote this file and you want to pass it off to someone who doesn't really know YAML or whatever, but you want them to be able to output YAML, and they can just say -- name is nginx -- port, right? And then rather than have them go in and change the values or...
Yeah, so this is a conversation that's come up just recently with the Pickle folks, is this idea of having essentially an API to the Pickle configuration. And that doesn't exist yet, but I think that's something that will come at some point. I've experimented with using Pickle to define Gradle builds. And in that case, part of what I wanted to get to was being able to run my Gradle command, add dependency foo, and have it update my Pickle, right? And so that tooling API doesn't exist yet for Pickle, but I'm sure it'll come at some point to support the kind of use cases that you're talking about. Good questions. Okay, moving on to, so that was for Kubernetes. Let's move on to, let's do CloudFormation. So there is a CloudFormation. If you're using CloudFormation to define your infrastructure for Amazon, there is a Pickle library that, like the Open API for Kubernetes one, it gets built based on the actual schemas of CloudFormation and then generates the Pickle libraries. So that means that we get some type information for things like a role, right? And all of the different things that you can do in CloudFormation, you can do in Pickle. So that's all great, and I've started defining my AWS infrastructure with Pickle and like it. It's good, but one of the cool things that I can do is start to now create some higher level libraries on top of that foundational thing. So one of the things that I did was I just wanted to be able to, in like, let's see, this is 15 lines of code. I wanted to be able to spin up an entire website and have that website, have a domain name. I wanted to even have that domain name get registered automatically. And so I created a library that does exactly that. So now in my CloudFormation Pickle definition, I really get this concise API essentially to spin up a whole bunch of things. This ends up being like 500 lines of YAML underneath the covers, right? And so nice that now I get these higher level abstractions for some pretty complex CloudFormation. But CloudFormation Pickle library, it's great. It's up on GitHub. And if you're doing CloudFormation, so much better than YAML, in my opinion. So yeah, and then hopefully I'll make some more progress on some higher level Pickle libraries on top of that to do some more domain specific things like set up CI/CDs, set up websites, set up Lambda functions that are connected to databases, whatever. Okay, so that's CloudFormation support. Any questions on that one before I go on? Yeah, go ahead. Secret management in CloudFormation. So
No, I mean with Pickle itself.
For Pickle itself, so you can pass in environment variables and read properties files is the only way that you can like get outside stuff into Pickle so that then it comes out on the YAML side. And so you would have to start with the specifying the properties file. And I don't know what all the limitations are on properties files, if it has to be like in a properties form or something else, but it has to come in one of those two forms into Pickle so that then it can go into the output YAML. But maybe there's some way we could come up with a better way to do that if that's necessary. Yeah, let me know afterwards if we should explore that together. Okay, any other questions on CloudFormation Pickle? Okay, let's move on to the next one. So I have done a lot in GitHub Actions, and let's see if we can find that right project here. This one. Okay. If you were at my presentation on structured concurrency yesterday, I was sharing a project that I created called Easy Racer. And in Easy Racer, I do, for every kind of client of Easy Racer, I have a CI/CD pipeline. They're all pretty simple, but they just validate that things work. And so this is, in total, a lot of YAML files to maintain my CI/CD pipeline. So I started creating a Pickle GitHub action library to make it super concise to define all the things that I typically need in my GitHub actions. And so just as an example of this, I've got a .NET project, and so I just need to specify those 3 lines, and what I get out of that is that YAML here, right? So it's able to go from those 3 lines to the actual YAML that GitHub Actions needs. So again, just like really nice to be able to put this stuff into libraries so that I don't have to maintain all that YAML. I have now a much more concise definition for how I define all of my GitHub Actions. And one of the cool things that's happening here is Pickle has a way to output to multiple files. So in GitHub Actions, I want each of these in its own YAML file. And so I can say, like, hey, turn all this stuff, which there's a little bit of syntax down at the bottom that actually tells it which file to put the output into. But of course, you can go from one Pickle definition file to many YAML files or JSON files or whatever you want to output. So, and then my Pickle GitHub library is, Pickle GitHub Action library is up on my GitHub. So that's the URL for that, github.com, James Ward, Pickle GHA. And it still has more work to do. It's, I do need to look into doing like open API transformation to just automate some of that. But I focused on kind of higher level things that I need for my builds first. And so that's where that one's at. Okay, so that's the GitHub Action Pickle stuff, and I think that's it. We kind of went through all of it. So Pickle, let me show you some resources here if you want to learn more. So I've got this particular code walkthrough that I put in there is up on my GitHub as hello-pkl. And then there's the Hello Spring Kotlin. I do have the pickle part of that on a branch there. And then the pickle Kubernetes one, the Easy Racer build, which you can go look at the pickle source for the actions. And then my presentation website is the one that uses CloudFormation. So those are, I'll leave those up there in case you want to grab those. All right, well, hopefully that was useful. Use pickle, it's awesome. And thanks for coming.